I'm Laurel. My mother was Marion Coleman. I consider myself fortunate that I have lived in interesting times. I was born in 1936, and a lot of interesting things happened that year, but mainly I grew up during World War II on the home front, and then right after World War II in Berlin, Germany, in the American community there, before, during, and after the Berlin blockade and airlift. When you are abroad, or just about anywhere you go, and you meet new people, they always say, "Where are you from?" Well, I usually say Tennessee. But if you ask me, in your heart, where are you from? That is, what's the place that defines you and the city of your youth? I would say, I'm from Berlin. I'm a Berlinerin, because that is the city where I grew up and spent the most time when I was a child and when I was a teen. Children are remarkably resilient. You know, no matter where you are and what's going on, when you're a child, you think of that as normal. This is what life is about. This is what my life is like. And you figure everybody else's life is pretty much the same. In my generation, for most children, life was about mom and dad, siblings if they had any, being at home, World War II on the home front, quite possibly with dad away, serving in the war. But for me, my life was about many different things. It was a variety. My life was about adventure. It began with adventures in the woods on Signal Mountain near Chattanooga, Tennessee, where my grandparents had a little cabin, water from the spring. Later on we had iron water wells. There was no electricity at that place until well after World War II, and we had, for warmth, the fireplace and kerosene heaters, and we had for light the fireplace and Coleman lanterns, white gas lanterns. Because my name was Laurel Coleman, and those were Coleman lanterns, when I was a little girl, the first time I ever saw a Coleman lantern at somebody else's house, I went to my daddy and said, "They stole our lantern. It's got our name on it." Clearly, I thought it was ours. I loved the woods and the creeks. I called my grandmother, my father's mother, Bumba, and the name stuck. She was called Bumba for the rest of her life by her other grandchildren, as well as by me. I called my father's father Dandy, and I loved him enormously. He was wonderful. He was my buddy. He taught me what unconditional love is all about. He also taught me how to dip water from the spring without getting sand in the bucket, how to watch out for poisonous snakes, always to step on a log and then down to the other side rather than stepping directly over it, how never to put your hand, foot, or any part of yourself in a place you couldn't see, and how to sit very, very quietly in the woods so that the little animals would be curious and come up and check you out and nibble at your toes or fingers. I have sat still while a bobcat came out to eat at the pet cat's dish within a foot to 18 inches of my hand. I slept on the screen porch, and every night the bobcat would come and eat the leftover cat food and look at me, and I would look back at him, and we were fascinated by each other. In addition to the creeks and the woods, the berry picking, my pony, my cat, my beautiful white collie, Robin, the land I loved and the people I loved in Tennessee, I also lived part of my young life in Gulfport, Florida. Grandma Tulsi, my mother's mother, was an interesting person, really funny, but she was probably the most selfish person I've ever known. And it's a wonder I ever lived to grow up, because she paid no attention to where I was or what I was doing all day long. as long as I showed up for supper and went to church with her at least twice on Sundays. I used to go with a wash tub, a galvanized wash tub, to the sand flats about 3/4 of a block from Grandma Tulsey's house in Gulfport, Florida, right there on the bay. And I dragged the wash tub over the oyster beds, wearing tennis shoes, so as to cut my feet less. I won't say not to cut my feet, because I got cut all the time, but to cut my feet less, I would wear tennis shoes, drag the wash tub over the oyster flats, and float it on the water at low tide, and then go along, swim along, pushing the wash tub, looking into the clear water for shells that I could pick up, put in the wash tub, take home, and add to my collection, or for specifically scallops that I could put in my wash tub to take home for supper. And the roomers in Grandma's rooming house would pay me 50 cents a piece for supper, for scallops. They would shuck the scallops, Grandma would cook them, and that's one of the ways I earned money. The tide would come in while I was pushing the wash tub along, and it took me about an hour and a half to push the wash tub out to the farthest part, and then it took me the whole rest of the day to swim back pushing the wash tub, which by then was floating low in the water, and I had to push it very slowly so that I didn't accidentally slop water in it and lose my fabulous cargo of goodies in the wash tub floating on top of the water. Before my mother went overseas as a wire service editor for AP and a staffer for the Office of War Information in London, she and I lived in Nashville. We lived in a dollhouse in Belmead. Housing was extremely short then, and a dollhouse was all she could find for us to rent when she was working out of the Tennessean offices on Broadway. So she would bump her head on the low doorways, and Grandma Tulsey, who was my caregiver staying with us at that time, would complain constantly about the tiny space we had to work in. She had to sleep on a couch in the dollhouse living room, while my mother and I shared a bed in the dollhouse one bedroom. We all shared the tiny bath and the tiny kitchen. But of course, being a child, I saw things through the eyes of a child, and I thought they'd done this just for me. We lived in a dollhouse. What more could any little girl ask? I had my Cocker Spaniel Sugar. I had a cat I called Rosie, who turned out to be a tomcat later on, but of course at the time I really didn't know the difference. And I had paper dolls that I played with. On the radio, we would listen to Frank Sinatra and others singing Paper Doll. And that too, I thought, was just for me.